It is really hard for us to imagine the space that is between plays and how time changes things. 478 or 79 years elapsed between the play Hippolytus and the play Phaedra. The first by Euripides, the second by Seneca. In years later, 478 years would take us way past Racine's production of, he says, Euripides' play in the name Phaedra. More than 478 years, far more than 478 years between Racine's Phaedra and Sarah Kane's Phaedra, her version of the Phaedra legend as well. It's 428 before the Common Era, 428 BC for those of you who operate that way. Hippolytus was premiered, if you like, by Euripides. In the year 50 AD or CE, 478 years later, Phaedra comes on. We kind of think a lot of the time that the Greeks and the Romans are very similar. They're, classical literature, classical plays, but it really is stark when you sit down and read them, much less watch them. You will see occasionally the odd Greek play produced, but you very seldom see the Romans. It's a 500-year gap. It's further back from here than to Shakespeare. A reasonable comparison is, I think it's about maybe 5-10 years out, but the morality play, the play of the weather from 1533, is the best part of 470 odd years from that. 478 years from that to Hamilton. It's a gap. It's a huge gap, and it's very hard for us to conceive of that. If we think that Shakespeare is a long way away, we have to go further back to meet that equal. So, apart from the fact that this play seems to recur, what are the major differences between it? The Romans would have had their theatres indoors for a start, as opposed to the Greeks outdoors, which allowed for, I would argue, longer, more carefully spoken and carefully written plays. They are much more word heavy. It's much easier to continue to the length you get with Phaedra by Seneca being indoors than it is being outdoors trying to blast out Hippolytus. There literally is a physical requirement that you need to be outdoors that you don't have with Seneca, that you do with Euripides. And I think that colors and changes the way the play is. It's also important to note that at this time, these plays, in the time of the Greeks, I should say, these plays were the only show in town. Basically, if you're going to do something for entertainment, that's what you're going to. By the time of Seneca, these were not the only things that were to see. You had the choice of going maybe to the Circus Maximus, or you could perhaps go to the amphitheaters. And this is an important thing to note. The amphitheaters being what they are and when they are, these were places where literally you saw violence. The Greeks eschewed it. They avoided demonstrations of violent acts on stage. The Romans went to see that. You also have the different an element of class. Now, I know there is a degree to which we must note that anybody who's going to a Greek play is a free man, which means that they probably aren't completely impoverished, and they're certainly not a slave, and they're a guy. Whereas with the Romans, it was much more a case that this was an entertainment for the better educated, the comparatively well off. And that changes how the play is. These are all factors that contribute to why they're different. Again, being outdoors to a massive crowd. Euripides, in some senses, has a much more, even though it feels like a shorter play, Euripides has a slower, more patient character build-up. Whereas Seneca is just like, bam, here's who I am. Really sudden, really violent in its own way. For a play that is mostly words and not much action, it is a much more violent play in the hands of Seneca than it is in Euripides, in my opinion. spoilers for somebody who hasn't read the, I don't know, 2,000-year-old play. But in contrast, the contrast between Hippolytus and Phaedra, in terms of violence, Phaedra commits an on-stage suicide. In Phaedra, everybody bar Theseus pretty much is dead. Hippolytus gets killed on his chariot, racing away from the scene of the crime, or the scene of the no crime. Phaedra kills herself. She impales herself on a sword, leaving Theseus kind of stepping away from the body, ignoring almost the body of Phaedra in an aim to regain the body parts of his son, who has been strewn all over the road. So this violent end is in contrast to in Phaedra, where Phaedra does kill herself, but she does that off stage. But it allows for Theseus and Hippolytus to have a reunion. There is a positive at the end of this one that you don't always get at the end of Euripides. Not looking at you directly, Medea, but Seneca leaves us no consolation. Euripides gives us hope of reunification. Obviously, there are character differences as well, particularly when you look at Euripides. Hippolytus is much more chaste. I mean, his downfall is brought by his chastity, ultimately. He is saving himself for Artemis, and that annoys Aphrodite, who creates this kind of sexual tension for Phaedra. Phaedra has the world out of her control. In the case of Seneca, there are no gods. Phaedra, having been neglected, I think it's fair to say, by Theseus, almost being treated cruelly. And this is a thoughtless Theseus in Seneca. She sets her eyes towards Hippolytus and is very much more active, I think, in her pursuit of him. And it feels more deliberate in all her actions, more thought through, more considered, whereas Phaedra in Euripides is at the hands of the gods, almost their plaything. To bring it back to Hippolytus, with the setup that Seneca has given him, Hippolytus is not so much chaste for the gods. The gods do not matter in the Roman world here, as misogynistic. He has a vile loathing of women. Perhaps you could argue it's to do with the death and neglect of his mother. Perhaps it's something deeper and darker. But certainly in Seneca, it does have a colour of misogyny about it, rather than, if you will, professional care for his religious beliefs. Yeah. So Theseus Theseus is not the best of guys. Even if his ship is interesting from a philosophical standpoint, he's not great. In both cases, he's on a second marriage, obviously, for it to be a stepson. So while it is an incest of a kind, I don't know, would the Greeks have thought, well, it's not the worst kind of incest. And my inclination is to think it's pretty bad. It's not Oedipus, but this is a betrayal on the part of the son for the father, if he were to give in, which in many ways heightens Hippolytus to being a noble character. And his redemption at the end is, for me, what makes it kind of valid for Euripides to call his play Hippolytus. He is there at the end. In the case of Seneca, it is Phaedra is there at the end, killing herself on stage. So in so many ways, the naming makes sense. Phaedra is a woman mistreated and left hung out to dry in the modern sense in Phaedra, in the Seneca. In the case of Euripides, clearly it feels to me like he felt that Phaedra was the most interesting and exciting character because she is the most vividly written. But again, she she also has this element of things are out of her control. And that is, for me, the chief difference between the two. Euripides is all about the will of the gods. We start off with one god giving out to us, complaining that Hippolytus, a beautiful, beautiful man, will not pray to her. He will not bow before her. Instead, he cares more for Artemis. Well, she'll settle his wagon, and settle it she does by incurring Phaedra and leaving Artemis to go, it's not my fault. It's not my fault you don't like me. We'll see about you someday. In the case of Seneca, they're all masters of their own destiny to some degree. It's set in play in many ways by the indifference of Theseus, while Phaedra is left harking for something, harking for a human touch, we could say, in this time of plague. Phaedra sees in Hippolytus what she loved about her husband, who knows what he's really doing. He's indifferent to her charms and indifferent to her life. She searches with her loving and open heart. And yeah, she makes mistakes. But which of us doesn't make mistakes? Just want to recommend that we don't spend too much time with stepsons and stepdaughters. Just a hint there for everybody. Racine claimed that his Phaedra was based on Euripides. And in the sympathy for Phaedra, I see that. But in story, it feels so much more like Seneca. In the case of Brian Friel's play Living Quarters, it is very much Euripides' Hippolytus that he follows. And as for Sarah Kane, in such a violent, vicious, and in some senses hopeless play, it is unquestionably Seneca who takes the lead. The violence of this play, for a play that is, let me see, is this the page? Incredibly wordy. It is all words, 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 words. Don't know if you can see that okay. For a very wordy play that nobody who thinks to talk takes less than 10 minutes to do so, it is very violent in terms of the language, but also in terms of that slow, vile build-up to this ghastly suicide at the end. It's powerful stuff. But again, maybe Seneca's more to read than to watch, and Euripides more to watch than to read.